Rain World. Rain World is a game where you play as this little white squirmy thing called a slug cat, who's unfortunately at the bottom of the food chain. You're forced to survive and explore a world where everything tries to kill you, from the environments, the creatures, and even the rain. But although surviving feels hopeless when living in a world where all odds are stacked against you, it's up to you to learn how to use your resources and experience to your advantage, since one small slip up can end up being your last. You exit a pipe and fall down a small pit. There's no music to accompany you, only the ambient sounds of water droplets in the ground and a quiet but constant whirring of the wind. Looking around, you begin to see industrial structures that have been abandoned long ago, some broken down due to rain and time. But as you explore the area around you, you soon encounter a yellow holographic being known as an overseer. They begin to teach you the basic fundamentals of surviving, using only holograms and symbols to communicate. During this encounter, you're taught the four main fundamentals of survival: movement, such as walking, climbing, and leaping; obtaining food, whether it's from the bats flying around or the hanging berries; and combat, teaching how to use spears and rubble to fight against predators. As you press forward, you begin to notice the ground vibrating. With each passing second, the vibrating gets more and more intense, and you soon realize that the vibrations are being caused by the pounding of the rain above. Suddenly, it's a fast dash towards the nearest shelter, and once you find and enter it, the gates behind you begin to close, and this is when you learn your fourth and final fundamental of survival: hibernation. After this quick and brief tutorial, you're no longer taught anything for the rest of the game. It leaves you with the basics, allowing you to discover different types of movement, food, and combat on your own. After hibernating, you're led out of the area and into the first region of the game, the outskirts. A gloomy industrial area packed to the brim with weird structures and machinery, the outskirts introduces you to the strange world that is Rain World. Exploring the outskirts, the first thing that you notice is this game's visuals. For Rain World being a pixel art game, it has amazing attention to detail, from showing the effects of a world that has been broken down due to its own harsh environment, to building a story by using its structures to present an idea of what the world used to be. But as you explore the regions, you slowly begin to realize that this game tends to provide more questions than answers. Most structures are just barely discernible. Even stranger is the graffiti and symbols that scatter the areas, presenting the idea that there was or even still is intelligent life before this world became what we know it as now. Adding on to this idea that there was or even still is intelligent life in this world are its regions. Some regions include a dumping ground for garbage, a drainage system, and even a citadel, so it's more than likely that something major occurred which led to the extinction of most life. It's clear that our story is taking place after some sort of apocalyptic event, most likely having something to do with the rain, but that's about the only true conclusion that you can draw from exploring the regions. I want to refrain from entering spoiler territory, so keep in mind this is just scratching the surface, so as you progress through the game, trust me, it gets convoluted. During playthroughs, people tend to focus on the more chaotic parts, and for good reason. However, it's the moments between the chaos where you truly begin to get an appreciation for the art. But it's not just environments. Creatures such as vultures, monster kelps, scavengers, Miro's birds, even leviathans are so creative and well made, it creates this incredible cohesion between Rainworld's strange yet hostile atmosphere and its creatures. Rainworld does an amazing job of utilizing scale, sound design, even movement to create unique yet downright terrifying creatures that fill you with a sense of dread whenever you encounter them. Take Miro birds for example. Miro birds are these large flightless birds who inhabit a specific part of the world called the memory crypts. They have big ovular bodies with pincers for mouths and legs, making them fast, dangerous predators. However, their most distinct feature is the sharp piercing sound that they make that helps notify the player that they're approaching. This sound is absolutely horrifying, knowing that if you don't make a decision in time, you will be dead, which I think is a phenomenal way of implementing sounds and visuals to define a creature. Funnily enough though, the visuals of the creatures aren't their best feature. What truly makes the creatures in this game stand out is their AI. The AI in this game is masterfully done. Oftentimes, you'll encounter creatures interacting with other creatures, the environment, or a certain predicament that they're in, which does an incredible job of making them feel realistic rather than making them feel artificial. They'll react to your sound and proximity, finding any way that they can in order to kill and eat you. Whether that be cornering you, cutting you off, or simply using the environment to get an advantage, it is insane how smart and aggressive most of these creatures are towards you. I mean, this is a world where food runs scarce, so it's understandable that they'll do anything they possibly can if it means they can satisfy their hunger for just a bit longer. But out of all these creatures, one of them stands out the most: the scavenger. Scavengers are the most intelligent and, surprisingly, the most social creatures in Rainworld. They're tribal creatures that appear in all sorts of colors and are one of the few creatures in this game that are passive to you unless you end up provoking them first. They're often seen traversing in packs and are the closest creatures in the game that share the biggest resemblance to you. At first glance, they seem pretty normal. They're clearly in the same situation as you and other creatures, scavenging for food and fending off predators. But as you begin to encounter more and more of them, you start to notice that they're not so similar to other creatures after all. First off, they're very valuable. They give you opportunities to trade items which couldn't be found anywhere else around the world, such as grenades and explosive spears. They even help you take care of threats and potentially save you from dangerous situations. However, it doesn't work that easily. Relationships between the player and scavengers rely on a reputation-based system which defines how they view you. If you're constantly seen trading with them, helping, or saving them in situations, and remain friendly all throughout, they'll slowly build up their trust in you, meaning they won't view you as an enemy anymore and they stop being a threat. On the other hand, if you're constantly seen attacking and or killing them, your reputation goes down, leading to them immediately viewing you as an enemy and becoming more aggressive when they spot you. But the most impressive difference comes from the fact that they actually display real emotion. Their eyes widen when they're afraid. They physically warn the player not to get close. They signal with their hands if they want something from you or if they give you permission to pass. It's little things like this which seem pretty small in scale but end up adding so much to the experience. They also spawn in with different behaviors that affect how they view you. For example, their personality might be aggression, which makes them more inclined to view you as a threat and attack you. Or maybe their personality is being nervous, which ends up making them try to avoid you at all costs. At the end of the day, what makes the scavengers so great is that their AI feels human. The combination of emotions, personalities, reputation, and even their thought process really sets them apart from any other creature, and is an incredible example of AI done right. One thing that all of these creatures teach you is that you're not the main character in this world. You just serve as another part of the ecosystem, desperately fighting to survive. But why? Prior to starting your game, you get a brief overview of the events that transpired, giving you background to how you ended up in your situation. While out hunting with your family, you get caught up in heavy rainfall, where you eventually lose your grip and plunge into the water below, leaving you separated from your family and giving you the one and only objective so far: finding your family. Seems pretty straightforward, but for some odd reason, when you fell into that water and ended up at the start of your journey, you somehow managed to enter this endless cycle of death and rebirth, which you and every other creature in this world are forced to endure forever, giving you your second and last objective: escaping the cycle. These objectives end up feeling daunting, impossible even, but luckily, you're accompanied by the Yellow Overseer, who for some reason has garnered an interest in you. It helps guide you through the terrains, pointing out danger, showing nearest shelters, and leading you to people who can help you uncover the truth. Eventually, you learn of a way to finally escape the cycle and achieve true death. But keep in mind, this doesn't make you special. You're not the only creature stuck in this cycle. It affects every living thing, reminding you that you're not playing as a main character of this world because there is no main character. Whether you're dead, not on a certain section, or leave an area, the world and its creatures continue on as usual. Nonetheless, it doesn't even matter if you're important in this world or not. This world is just too far gone, with no signs of it getting better in the future. We don't know much about how the world got to the state that it is. However, there are these colored pearls scattered around each region that could be used to discover something about the past, which help give you an understanding of who you are and what caused the world to deteriorate. What we definitely do know though is that there is no saving this world, so the one thing you need to focus on is breaking the cycle and finally leaving this world behind. Look, this game is phenomenal. However, I don't want you to get the wrong idea that it's a perfect game, because in reality, it's not. As much as I love Rainworld, there are some negatives to it that I just can't gloss over, and the perfect place to start is the difficulty. This game is fucking bullshit. You will constantly be put into situations that you just can't win, especially in the later portions of the game where tougher enemies scatter the areas. No matter how hard you try to prevent it, you will die again and again and again, losing so much of your progress and being forced to repeat everything. Remember, you're an incredibly fragile creature, meaning you can be killed with one shot by pretty much anything. After all, you are at the bottom of the food chain. When you start, you eventually realize that you're very limited with what you can do to defend yourself, with your only real advantage against them being your movement. Even then, your movement won't save you from everything, since you're not always given the option to run. The only true and reliable way that you have in order to defend yourself are spears. It's the only object that you can find littered around the world which you can use to inflict damage and kill enemies. Using a spear is pretty simple. Just hit your enemy. The problem, however, comes from the fact that most creatures are built with their own defense mechanisms, which make hitting and killing them a lot harder than it sounds. Take lizards for example. Hitting them anywhere around the body will inflict damage. Hit them enough times and they'll eventually die. But one thing that you notice immediately when you first fight them is that any spear that you throw towards their head will bounce off, leaving them stunned for a second but doing no damage. You eventually realize that their heads are encased in a strong and durable shell, and since they run towards you head first, attacking them ends up becoming more of a challenge since you're forced to find a way to either maneuver around them and find an opportunity to strike, or force them to expose their bodies with the use of rubble. It also doesn't help that you're only able to throw objects horizontally, so you're at a huge disadvantage when predators are above or below you. Don't forget, this is the first enemy that you see in the game. You encounter more enemies with more advanced defense mechanisms as you progress, such as the use of their tongue to snatch your items or you yourself, antennas to communicate with other lizards to overwhelm you, camouflage in order to catch you with your guard down, or electrocution used to stun and or kill you. Of course, you don't get taught this, and this is where experience plays a huge part in how the gameplay functions. In order to learn how the world and its creatures work, you have to go through a process of trial and error, finding out what works and what doesn't, leading to a lot of deaths which are essential to getting better. Once you get a greater understanding of most of the creatures, it ends up opening way more opportunities on how to fight against them, but in no way does it make fighting them easier, and that to me is the hardest part about this game. No matter how experienced you can end up being, it won't take away from the fact that you will always remain susceptible to them, and will, most likely, still end up dying anyways. And speaking of the difficulty being unfair, we have Rain World's RNG. RNG is a simple way of describing a game's randomness and how a certain thing occurring is left to chance rather than it being scripted. For instance, Rainworld's maps and regions aren't RNG, meaning no matter how many times you die or reset your save, the map will always stay the same. Items and creatures on the other hand are RNG, meaning you probably won't find them in the same spot as other saves or attempts. Of course, there are some exceptions, but you get the idea. RNG plays a major part in this game's punishing difficulty. There are times when the game decides to spawn a ton of enemies, making your journey to the next shelter unbelievably hard, but on other times, the game decides to spawn very few enemies, making your journey incredibly easy. The issue with the RNG in Rain World is that you have no control over it. If the game chooses to spawn a bunch of tough enemies which end up getting you killed, well, tough luck. Now you're forced to repeat all of your progress knowing the fact that you had no control over the RNG on that attempt. Same goes with items. Since spears are the only common item that can be found around the world that does damage, it's vital that you obtain one. But if the RNG decides not to spawn any near you, you're left with no way to fight against any enemies that you might encounter, which seriously ends up being infuriating at times. Remember how I said that the AI in this game is amazing? Well, that's still true. However, there's one exception to that, and that exception is reindeer. Reindeer are large, black, neutral creatures that inhabit the region Farmer raised. They have long but slender legs, which give them the ability to traverse high above the ground, incredibly useful for the terrain that they inhabit. You see, Farmer raised is polluted with creatures called wormgrass. They're not dangerous by itself, but bunch them up with others, and suddenly they become one of the most dangerous and feared creatures in the game. They latch onto you and try to pull you towards them. If you have enough momentum or not enough of them grab you, you'll be able to pull away, but if too many of them latch on, you're left helpless as they pull you towards them and are then forced to watch yourself get consumed. There are two versions of wormgrass, black wormgrass and red wormgrass. Black wormgrass are seen in small patches and are pretty easy to avoid. Red wormgrass, on the other hand, are seen in large numbers which cover the surface of the region. The biggest difference between these two variants is that unlike its black variant, red wormgrass is not traversable by yourself. There's just too many of them, meaning that trying will always result in failure. Luckily, that's where reindeer come in. Since their legs allow them to traverse the area high above the ground, they're insusceptible to wormgrass, making them one of the only creatures that can't be affected by it. This means that in order to make it past the red wormgrass, you'll need the help of reindeer. Using the help of reindeer to traverse areas in the game sounds cool, and that's because it is. However, the problem with this comes down to the fact that reindeer just aren't reliable. In order to ride them, you need to reach their antlers. This can be done by obtaining food that will make them bend down, allowing you to climb onto their antlers and traverse the wormgrass. But this is where the problems begin to show. Food is vital when using reindeer. Since they have very low spawn rates, throwing a spore puff on the ground basically always guarantees for one of them to spawn and head towards your direction. However, you'll need another spore puff in order to reach their antlers. This means that in order to use reindeer effectively, you'll need a minimum of 2 spore puffs. That's why it's frustrating when one decides not to work, since you're very limited on spore puffs, and not having enough is basically a death sentence. When you climb onto their antlers, there's a pretty big chance that it will glitch them out, making them stay in the same spot, twitching but not moving. It takes quite a long time in order for them to eventually fix themselves and function properly, but even this isn't guaranteed. If they decide not to work, it'll sometimes leave you with no way out, giving you the choice to either kill yourself or wait out the inevitable. Another thing is that their pathfinding can easily break. There will be times when reindeer will randomly stop in their tracks in order to calculate where it wants to place its leg. This sometimes leads to it just dropping unexpectedly since it couldn't decide. You can control where they go by using its antlers, however, it doesn't even work half of the time and they'll eventually decide to go wherever they want to. Using reindeer is basically a coin flip. They either work flawlessly and as intended, or they just don't work at all. Thankfully, using reindeer is only required in very small parts of the region. Nonetheless, them working being dependent on RNG is still dumb and annoying to deal with. Difficulty and RNG play major roles in making new players avoid this game, but by far the biggest thing that deters new players is how shrouded in mystery it all is. Immediately from the get-go, you're offered very little information about the game. It gives you the bare minimum that you need to survive, and that's it. No specific waypoints, no missions, nothing. The reason why RainWorld gives little information about itself is in order to avoid giving you an exact path or way to progress. It leaves you with complete control of how you want to approach the game instead of how the game wants you to. Of course, with no restrictions on where you can go or what you can do, most players end up deviating from the paths that RainWorld intends for you to follow, eventually finding themselves in regions that they aren't supposed to be in. The Yellow Overseer definitely helps at times, but it's very vague with its directions and symbols, plus it's not always there to give you directions. It's hard to get involved in the game when you don't know what to do. Most people run around, encounter a creature, wait till rain comes, then call it quits because it's hard to understand the game and you can't even blame them. Same could be said about the mechanics. Since the game doesn't teach you any other mechanics apart from the necessary ones, you'll most likely play the entirety of this game without ever knowing about the other useful and unique types of movement and combat that this game has to offer. For example, you're able to slide by holding diagonally down and pressing the jump button. Combine this with throwing a spear and you'll be able to pierce straight through a lizard's head. There's also backflipping, where once you reach the apex of your backflip, you'll be able to throw a spear vertically rather than just horizontally, opening opportunities which were inaccessible before. Learning mechanics like these make this game so much easier, but like I said, you never get taught this. If you want to learn these mechanics, you'll have to go out of your way to research and find them yourself. Most players, however, don't do this, which I think is a shame because learning them makes the RainWorld experience even better. And sometimes what you do learn from the game might not even be entirely correct. One of the biggest things that you learn while playing is that anything and everything will kill you, and is why you'll most likely be afraid and avoid any creature that approaches you. This is fine until you enter certain segments of the game where you realize that some sections are impossible to pass. It takes a while to figure out, but just like the reindeer, the help of creatures is needed. But honestly, this was probably just a personal problem, but I wish it was slightly easier to draw that conclusion. There's just so much to learn in Rain World that it ultimately feels overwhelming. The fact that you're practically put into a cruel world that you know nothing about, and then being forced to survive in it is really hard to adapt to. The difficulty, RNG, and the mystery behind Rain World are negatives that really end up dragging this game down. But the more that you play this game and start to become better and more experienced, the more that you start to realize that its worst features actually tend to become its best. The difficulty of this game is brutal, but it's to be expected. It perfectly aligns with who you are. You're not some untouchable, strong creature. You're a slug cat. You're fragile, and instead of relying on items to make you strong, it has you rely on experience. The difficulty being so brutal also ends up making your journey to completing this game worthwhile and earned. Rain World doesn't pull its punches. Everything is against you, but managing to push through what feels like impossible odds and make it to the end feels euphoric and much more rewarding than if it were to be an easy journey. It's just so refreshing to finally have a game that doesn't hold back, but at the same time isn't just made difficult for the sake of being difficult. The RNG in Rain World is unfair. However, the unfairness of this game is what leads to such unique experiences. You will never have the same experience as anyone else who plays this game. Sure, you could have similar, but never the same. It's fun not to know what to expect once you leave your shelter. The RNG might make the game really easy, or it might make it really unfair. Rain World knows this, and that to me is my favorite part. Instead of Rain World trying to hide that it's an unfair game, it thrives in it. Nature is random, you can't control what happens, but what you can do is adapt to it. It's one of the foundations that this game is built upon. The mystery that surrounds this game is confusing, but it's not without reason. Like the RNG, it helps cultivate a unique experience. This game values experimentation. You won't learn much if you don't try to expand your knowledge, and it's why it leaves you with nothing but the bare minimum, so it could help motivate you to figure things out by yourself. Vague directions on where to go encourage the player to explore and discover the world, which couldn't be done with a predetermined path. The two things that Rain World doesn't want to do is tell you what to do and how to do it. It wants you to find that out on your own. The mystery behind this game is seriously undervalued. There are so many things that you experience that just wouldn't be the same if it was scripted and predetermined. Although these negatives slowly became the best part about this game, this still doesn't mean that Rain World doesn't have its flaws. Some points made about the negatives still hold weight, like never learning other useful mechanics or the game being unfair. There's also other stuff that I didn't mention, like the camera being awful or some of the regions being annoying to deal with. Nonetheless, these flaws don't ruin the experience, they're more like inconveniences that you're forced to deal with. Rain World is a game that has me conflicted on how I recommend playing it. On one hand, knowing beforehand what you're getting yourself into and receiving tips improves your experience immensely. But on the other hand, there is no other experience like your first time playing Rain World blindly and with no expectations. But whichever one you choose doesn't really matter. So if you've given up and put the game down in the past or feel intrigued with what this game has to offer, there's just one thing I want you to consider. Give this game a shot.